So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Atticus Murphy as our seminar speaker today. Atticus did his undergrad at University of Toronto and then came directly from there with a summer off to start a PhD with me at Tufts. And then I moved across the country and he was able to come join me last year and will be more or less around as a postdoc during the coming year if you want to talk with him some. And I guess I'll give a little bit of the introduction I gave for his dissertation talk, which is that Atticus has really been a delight to work with. And his project actually started 8 years ago, a couple of years before he started his PhD, when I was professor at Tufts and the vice provost at Tufts emailed the faculty and said, do we want to nominate someone for this MacArthur Foundation $100 million grant to make the world a better place? And I was like, that's not what I do. But then I was walking home through one of the most densely populated areas in the US. And I was like, actually, we could make the world a better place by converting, weedy yards and paved yards into flower gardens for pollinators and other wildlife. And I pitched my idea and the vice provost was like, no, you don't do that. And 2 years later, I wrote an NSF proposal and the reviewers were like, no, you don't really know what you're doing yet. But Atticus and a group of about 6 grad students kind of just believed I did know what I was talking about or helped me learn what I was talking about. And without me having any funding for any of them, spontaneously decided to help me build this into an actual research program. And of those students, Atticus took on the most challenging part of it, which was thinking from what I would call a theoretical ecologist's perspective about the role that all of the people owning all the different yards play in creating pollinator gardens on landscapes and how the mechanisms of human behavior, with apologies to anyone who really studies human behavior, scale up to patterns that are important for pollinators. So with that.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here. So I'm Atticus. I am now a postdoc, newly minted last week. Defended last month. So this is really exciting work that I'm glad to get to talk to you about today. But I'm going to open with a question. And it's, what do these things have in common? So first, prescriptions of a newly created drug, recycling, and the aesthetic design of a front yard. And I always have to count to 5 to actually give you time to think about it. Okay, that's enough time. These behaviors are actually all socially contagious. So in the case of a newly created drug, doctors become more likely to start prescribing that drug once their friends who are doctors start prescribing that drug. People are more likely to recycle if they see that their neighbors are starting to recycle. And actually, the aesthetic design of front yards tends to be similar between neighbors. And this is a phenomenon that results in these mimicry between people who interact, right? And just to dive in on that last point a little more, yard landscaping in general kind of conforms to social norms. And I think we all know this intuitively from living in the world. In the United States, right now, the norms are biodiversity for turf grass lawns. And these are a pretty powerful current norm. This is a picture from the 1940s. And in Levittown in Long Island. And if you went back there today, you'd see that the landscaping of turfgrass lawns and small hedges persists to this day. So these are pretty strong social norms on what the area around your house should look like. But there is a small but growing movement of planting diverse pollinator gardens and other diverse flower gardens in front yards. And my dissertation really tried to explore whether this novel practice might be socially contagious like other things are. In other words, could gardening be spreading between nearby neighbors? One of the reasons that an ecologist would be interested in this question is that urban flower gardens provide really valuable habitat for insects. And many insects are unfortunately feared to be in decline. This includes pollinators. Probably this room doesn't need to be reminded of this fact, but over 85% of all flower species on Earth benefit from insect pollination. So this is obviously an ecologically important group. And urban gardens are actually home to a surprisingly diverse insect community when compared to other types of habitat on Earth. So pollinator gardening, in response to these trends, involves planting diverse flowers to feed insects, right? And a key fact is that this works, right? In the sense that within gardens, flower diversity and abundance are really closely related to pollinator diversity and abundance, which means that when you plant more flowers and more different types of flowers, you get more pollinators and more different types of pollinators, right? So you provision habitat for more species. And as a result of that fact, we're just focusing on all types of diverse flower gardens here. So pollinator gardens in the strict sense, but also diverse vegetable gardens, ornamental gardens, et cetera. Because the key fact is that these are habitats that have a diversity of flowers. This all comes in the context of the fact that urban lands are kind of a new focus of conservation and ecology. And new, I'm using loosely here, I would say past 20 years. And part of this is because globally, actually only recently this became true, a majority of all people on Earth now live in cities, which means that most people on Earth experience nature in cities. So that's an interesting reason to do urban ecology. And then the other thing that has become increasingly recognized, is that cities actually have really substantial area. They cover a substantial portion of the Earth at this point. And residential areas in particular, like what I'm showing here in this aerial photo, make up a really big portion of urban areas. So just for context, the work that I did was in Boston, Massachusetts. And so in that city, front and backyards make up 43% of the total land area in that city. And when you scale up to the whole continent, if we look at this map, the black smudges are remote sense data suggesting that there's turf grass everywhere there's a black smudge. And that covers a large portion of the country, as you see. And in fact, so large a portion that grass and lawns might be the largest irrigated crop in the United States if you were to consider it such a thing. And it would cover an area the size of the state of Georgia. So these are large areas that we currently spend lots of time and effort maintaining as turf grass. So there's a big scope for improvement here, right? But one concern might be that this urban habitat could be too fragmented to be really beneficial for wildlife. When we think about individual yards are pretty small, so an individual garden is going to be pretty small. And that means that animals probably would need to use resources that are spread out across multiple yards. And if landowners who are all owning their own land here, if they all act independently, that could create this risk of fragmentation. In other words, that the patches are too far apart to support populations. So people like this often suggest that it would be helpful to kind of operate from the top down and try to create clusters of gardens and try to scale up habitat creation in a way that is connected. But one kind of under-recognized thing is that if contagion were occurring in gardening, this would be a bottom-up mechanism that reduces fragmentation, right, at a large scale. Just to visualize that a little further, if this is a textbook cartoon, where on the left you have fragmented habitat where each of the different colors could be a different habitat type, or in our case, maybe the blue is gardens. And in the fragmented situation, gardens are more or less randomly distributed, and they tend to be far apart from each other, and thus maybe not so connected. Whereas in a more connected situation, the gardens are not randomly placed, and instead they tend to be nearby each other, and thus they comprise a connected habitat and maybe could support animal populations more effectively. So contagion could be this bottom-up force that's operating to connect garden landscapes. In the rest of my talk, I'm going to talk about 3 projects that we did during my dissertation to try and assess the basic distribution of gardens, so the patterns and drivers of flower gardening in front yards. Then we asked whether there was evidence for social contagion of flower gardening after accounting for the background variation that we explored in chapter 1. And then last, we tried to start getting at what the ecological implications of this would be for a pollinator and a real urban landscape. So pollinator gardening is what I would call participatory. And as a result of it being voluntary, it means that in order to be effective, we need a lot of different people to do it, right? And there's been some past work mostly by geographers and social scientists trying to understand kind of the motivations of people who are gardening. Because we think this is a beneficial conservation action, we want to know who's doing it and what kind of perspectives they have on nature. But less is known about the current prevalence in the general population of flower gardening or pollinator gardening, and about what factors predict their predisposition to that in the general public. So in this section, I'm going to talk about 3 questions. So first is a really simple one, which is how much flower garden habitat is there right now in one city or one region? And then I'm going to ask what factors predict flower gardening and what factors predict diversity within gardens. And I'm going to look at 2 factors here, income and lot size. And the reason I'm looking at these are, first, income just is generally predictive of urban biodiversity. This has been called a luxury effect. This is one of the early things that got ecologists interested in urban ecology in the early 2000s. And this probably has lots of causes, but it's found in a lot of taxa that there is more biodiversity in higher income areas. It could be because they spend more money on plants and landscaping. It might be that they have different preferences for how their landscapes look, etc. But regardless of the causes, this expectation is that flower gardens and flower diversity would be linked to higher incomes. The reason we're interested in lot sizes is because we would expect them to also shape landscaping decisions. So larger yards tend to have more different types of landscaping, by which I mean, in this picture, you would say there's the turf grass area and there's the hedging area. You might also have an ornamental garden area. We might expect that small lots, so have small yards, and that this would lead to a constraint to gardening, right? You just don't have enough room to start a garden. This is certainly what our prediction was. And we also predicted from basic ecology that a small yard is a small patch, and therefore there should be fewer species in the patch, right? This is the species area relationship from basic ecology, which actually turns out to be more messy than you'd think if you look at the basic literature. But anyways, the basic ecology 101 thing is that there's small patches should have fewer species. And thus, we would expect, for these 2 reasons, that flower gardening and garden diversity would be linked to larger lot sizes. So to do this, we needed to make a map. So we selected 11 cities in Greater Boston, which is where Tufts University is. This is where I did my PhD. And these included dense cities that directly bordered Boston proper, as well as kind of medium density suburbs that were within 10 or 20 kilometers. So left side here would be a denser city closer to the urban core of Boston. And on the right would be those more outlying kind of like middle density suburbs. One of the things we had to do was to carefully decouple these things because in our region in Boston, these are positively correlated. And actually in pretty much the whole US, which I didn't really know, but in most of the US, lot size is correlated with income. So big lots have high incomes, and we needed to decouple that to kind of test these separately. So we carefully selected cities that just happened to not covary in that way. To make the map, we actually use Google Street View. So this is street level 360-degree imagery. They have a public API. You can feed it addresses, and it will give you images that look like this. And then we manually went through, by we I mean Audrey Carver and Daisy Bonifat, wonderful undergrads at Tufts, manually went through and scored each image as being either a flower garden on the left or one of 4 types of non-garden on the right. So we had categories for lawn, weedy yard, shrubby yard in the bottom left there, and non-vegetated in the bottom right. And that was just based on what the majority of the image you could see was. And we found mainly this was useful because it helped us distinguish flower gardens from these 4 other things. So this data set included every residence in the 11 cities except large apartment buildings, and that totaled 101,000 total addresses, which we got from the tax assessors. 86% of those images were scoreable. And so on this map, this is what the data looks like. The gray dots are various shades of gray. Those are the non-gardens, and the green dots are flower gardens. And you can see that we got pretty good coverage, 86% of all the addresses. Now we supplemented this with in-person surveys because we wanted to know what was going on the ground, not just with Google Street View. So we visited about 500 random yards, and these were stratified across all the 5 categories of yard and across all the cities. We did 3 visits, June, July, and August. That's the peak flower season in Boston. And then we recorded the number of flower species that were in bloom when we visited for each yard. And we also categorized each of the species that we counted as being either cultivated or weedy. Weedy species being, the term of art is spontaneous, meaning that they were not put there by a person. In this talk, I'm only going to talk about cultivated species. So using these in-person surveys at just that subset of 500 yards, right? Not the 100,000, but the 500 yards that we went to in person, we can then ground truth the Street View scores so we can see how on the ground conditions relate to what we said it was based on Street View imagery. And then we can also explore kind of within garden species richness trends, right? You can't get species richness from a blurry picture, but you can for these 500 yards that we visited in person. Our modeling approach was binomial mixed models. So this was to predict the probability of a yard being a flower garden versus any of the other types, right? So that's a binomial response. We did this on a census tract level. So it's per neighborhood. It gives us the prevalence of flower gardening for that neighborhood. We had fixed effects of lot size and income for those census tracts. Those were our 2 a priori variables we thought might be predictive. And then we have random effects of city, census tracts, and block group. This accounts for spatial autocorrelation, and I won't get into why we needed to do that or how, but you can ask me. For the within garden species diversity, so this is for the 500 yards we visited in person, we used negative binomial mixed models, and here we're predicting species counts. So just how many species per yard. And here we have per yard lot size and income. Again, it's census tract income here because the census doesn't tell you individual homeowners' incomes for privacy reasons. And we had a similar random effect structure here. So for our first question, how much flower garden habitat is there in this system? So we had, to remind you, 86,000 yards that we were able to score. And here's what the distribution of results look like. The pink bar at the top is the flower gardens and the green is the lawns. So 58% of the yards had lawns and about 2% had flower gardens in this data set. In terms of ground truthing, so comparing what was going on the ground, we found that yards that we said were flower gardens using Google Street View had about 3 times the floral richness per yard. So here on the y-axis is the average species richness per yard by category, and 3 times the floral species richness per yard, and about 2 times the total species richness. So on the left here is alpha diversity, on the right is gamma diversity. So there are gardens there. So next we wanted to ask what factors predict flower gardening, right? So income and lot size. So here on the x-axis we have lot size, and on the y-axis we have median household income. So the shade of red is going to be the prevalence of flower gardening. And we predicted that large lot neighborhoods and high income neighborhoods would have more gardens. But what we actually found was that there were more flower gardens in neighborhoods with high incomes, but small lots. So the top left of this graph. So the dashed lines are the means here. We also wanted to understand factors that drive diversity within gardens. And again, we tested these same 2 factors, right? So here on the x-axis, we have household income, and on the y-axis, we have species richness per yard. So each of these points is a yard, and we're drawing lines through them. So we had a fixed effect of yard type. So each of the yard types gets its own line, but it turns out the slopes don't vary. There's just a weak positive significant increase with income. So income has a positive effect on cultivated floral species richness, though it is a messy relationship. Interestingly, there was no effect of lot size on species richness of flowers, of cultivated flowers, across any of the categories. So what did we find with this section? We found that flower gardens are rare, but they are important. They were about 2% of front yards, but when they're there, they drive big increases in floral diversity. So 3 times the diversity per yard and twice the gamma diversity, right? And those patterns led to these crazy statistics, like 93 species of flower we only ever saw in flower gardens. And the comparable number for lawns was 4. So they're driving big components of the floral biodiversity in cities. We also found that income is linked to flower gardening and flower diversity, which supports the luxury effect for gardening. So rich people get more diverse landscaping, but we would caution that there are other demographic characteristics that are tightly correlated with income. So for instance, in our data, education was tightly linked to both income and flower gardening. We couldn't decouple every factor from every other factor. So it's an area of future research to try to figure out which of these is causal. So unexpectedly, we found that small lots actually had more flower gardens in them. So dense urban neighborhoods had more flower gardening. This is a picture of Elizabeth's old house in Somerville. She had a small flower garden. And in retrospect, this might not be that surprising. So previous studies found that big lots tended to have more turf grass as a proportion and more trees as a proportion. And so it might be that like lawns are not really seen as worthwhile to have in a really small lots. So it could be that small lots push you away from traditional lawn landscaping and towards all the alternatives. I think this has relevance for US urban planning because currently modern regulations state that you cannot develop a new suburb with small lots. So there are minimum lot size requirements that tend to be much larger than this. And I think that pushes the entire landscape towards lawns and suppresses biodiversity as a result. Okay, so that's the basic patterns of flower gardening. Now we wanted to see if it looked like it was contagious. So if those flower gardens were actually spreading between neighbors. And we approached this by thinking like, okay, so why did these flower gardens, these green dots, why did these get created? And in the first section, we explored kind of household characteristics like how big your yard is and how much money you make. But now we're testing this separate, but also human-focused thing of social feedback between people. And I just want to emphasize that both of these things matter, right? Like your income matters and also what your neighbors are doing. So we wanted to see if there's contagion and also how does contagion affect connectivity? I said it should increase connectivity, but we wanted to see if that's true. The key thing with contagion is that unlike these neighborhood scale effects, contagion should be super local. It should be really small scale, and it should be strongest between really nearby neighbors because those people interact the most. And I'm using interact very broadly because you don't have to talk to interact. You can also just see each other or see their yards, right? So the key signal of contagion would be elevated frequencies of gardening, specifically among the nearest neighbors, and it should decay with distance. We're going to use the same Google Street View data to answer this question. And the way we do that is that we say zoom in on an address. There's a yellow crosshair here. And here I've counted up how many gardens are within 10 neighbors in this case, but it could be any arbitrary n. And you can do that for a set of random non-gardens and a set of gardens. And so then you just calculate the proportion of neighbors within 10 neighbors that have a garden and are nearby a garden versus a non-garden, right? And to explore that a little more, here's the modeling approach. So we used a binomial mixed model. We had a fixed effect of, is this 10 neighbor neighborhood centered around a garden or centered around a non-garden? We did this for all 1,940 gardens that we found in our data set. That's the 2% of 86,000, right? And then we picked 1,940 random non-gardens to compare. And we also had random effects of city census tract and census block group, because remember, neighborhoods vary in their gardening rate. That's what we just established, but we're not actually interested in that for this. So we had these random effects of neighborhood to try to account for that background variation. We're just looking at how being near a garden affects your probability. So at an arbitrary scale, 5 neighbors here. Here on the x-axis, we have the center point of the neighborhood. So are you near a garden or are you near a non-garden? And on the y-axis is the proportion of that neighborhood of 5 neighbors that is predicted to have flower gardens. So it's prevalence of flower gardening. So at the scale of 5 neighbors, we see twice as much gardening within 5 neighbors of a garden compared to within 5 neighbors of a non-garden, right? So we would say this is evidence of contagion. And this difference is the effect size of a neighbor gardening, right? We can plot this difference over many different scales of neighborhood. Now on the x-axis, we're looking at the number of nearest neighbors. So we're looking farther and farther away from the focal garden. And on the y-axis, we're saying the effect size of that central point being a garden, right? How much of a boost is there? If it's 0, there's no difference from random. And what we find is that there's a lot more gardening among the nearby neighbors of flower gardens. We see 3 times as much gardening among next door neighbors. This is statistically significant out to about 10 neighbors away, but it tails off very quickly and it goes towards about 0 within 30 neighbors. And most of the action is within 5 neighbors of you. So 5 neighbors is really not a big area. I've drawn a red circle around 5 neighbors here. They can see each other from their houses in this neighborhood. And we think that makes this pretty good evidence for social contagion. So the strongest effect is at a really local scale, the people whose houses you can see. This suggests that it's not just driven by the fact that you're higher income or have smaller lots, right? Because this is probably a smaller scale than the variation in those confounding influences, right? You're probably a similar income level to your nearest neighbors. We wanted to know how much is this contributing to clustering? So how much change is there to connectivity, structural connectivity? And we did this with a simulation approach. So we reshuffled the location of flower gardens randomly. We did it across different scales. So we did it by city and then by tract and block group, which I should have mentioned. Block group is just like a smaller neighborhood. So you're just zooming in. And then we compared our observations to these random simulations. And we said, how much clustering is there at each scale? And this, we think, lets us to distinguish contagion versus neighborhood level clustering. Like we know that some neighborhoods garden more than others. And we measured connectivity using 3 metrics. So Clark-Evans index, which is a metric of aggregation. Not going to show you that one today. And then we also had average distance between gardens in meters, and the percent of gardens that are nearby to other gardens. And to explain what nearby is, we defined it somewhat arbitrarily as being within 50 meters, which is broadly consistent with the estimates of foraging distance for a solitary bee, as established by Nick, Chloe, and Karen in our lab. And this is work that they did in the same system. So on the x-axis here, we have the simulation or data type, because observed is also on the x-axis there. And on the y-axis, we have either the mean distance to nearest garden, so how far apart are the gardens on average, or the percent of gardens that are nearby another garden. So what we see is that there is substantially closer together, so in the observed situation compared to the random. So the random layout of those 940 gardens would lead to gardens that are about 138 meters apart. And our observed situation is a little under 120 meters. So, you know, it's a little over 10% different. But actually, that leads to this pattern where there's way more gardens that are within 50 meters of another garden, right? Within the foraging distance for a typical solitary bee. So random situation would have 15% of gardens are within 50 meters of another garden. But our observed situation was that we had 30% of gardens were within 50 meters of another garden. And I'll note that these simulations in the middle, where we're clustering by neighborhood or city, these neighborhood factors could account for some of the clustering. You can see that they're significantly more clustered. But we also see much more clustering than that in addition, right? The observed situation was even more clustered than those, which we think is the contribution of contagion. That's what takes you from B to C. So we think contagion actually probably is reducing habitat fragmentation. And this is neat because it could reduce the urgency of needing to coordinate garden creation, because just naturally neighbors are more likely to garden. if their neighbor is gardening. But we don't really know how this clustering of habitat affects urban pollinators, right? We think clustering is good because fragmentation is bad. This is an area of future research, right? And we tried to take a stab at that in the last thing I'm going to talk about today, which is trying to assess the ecological impacts of contagious flower gardening. So we've established that like some areas in the city have more gardens than others. Contagion contributes to this, right? The clustering. That means there's more habitat for insects in those places, or at least pollinators. But we don't really know how they're going to respond to that. One of the ways you could ask about how they respond to that is, do they use habitat more often when there's clustering compared to when there's not? Or when there's clusters of gardens, I should say. And we did this in a focal species. We use monarch butterflies. So they lay eggs on milkweed, that's their host. And the caterpillars then, a caterpillar is circled right there. They eat the leaves until they're ready to pupate. They become adults, like the one on the right. And then the cycle repeats, right? They lay eggs, etc. This species is common in urban gardens, but it's also a focus of conservation, as we know. So people plant milkweed in gardens, they plant flowers for them. We tested how monarch use of host plant, milkweed, varied with neighborhood context. And I'll explain what that means. So host plants are one resource for butterflies. That's where the eggs get laid. But there's actually also another resource for butterflies, which are nectar plants. And adults feed on those to fuel flight and reproduction. So if we think about neighborhood context varying, we could have a focal host plant here, which I'm going to draw a circle around. And we could measure use of that host plant as the neighboring density of host plants varies. I sketched this because it's not real data. This is a prediction. We predicted that as the x-axis, so that's host plant density, the y-axis is per stem oviposition, so that's egg laying rate on our focal stem. We predicted that there would be this hump-shaped relationship where you get the maximum use of milkweed at middle densities. And that's because at low densities, we thought monarchs would kind of have lower attractiveness to that area. They wouldn't hang out where there's no host plant. At really high densities, they'd get satiated, they'd run out of eggs, so there'd be too many plants to lay on. And so we'd get this peak use at intermediate densities. And this means that the effective host density, we actually couldn't really predict. We thought it could go higher with more host density or it could go lower, depending where on this hump we are. And I will tell you, in nature and in previous work, people usually find dilution. So more host plant means they run out of eggs. There's less use when there's more host. We don't know how that works in urban settings. We don't know where up this curve we are. We also wanted to know how varying densities of nectar plant would affect host plant use. So again, we have a focal plant here, a focal milkweed stem. And if we imagine counting how many eggs are laid on that stem as the amount of flowers in the neighborhood varies. Here, I'm just going to say flowers are analogous to gardens, you can imagine. So some neighborhoods have more gardens and more flowers than other neighborhoods. And here the prediction is simpler because we would just say that there's probably going to be more monarchs laying eggs in the neighborhoods with more gardens, more flowers, right? That's because nectar gives you higher fecundity and lifespan, and butterflies move slower when there's more flowers around. So they should just use the habitat more that has more flower gardens. So my sketch would be, as nectar plant density or garden density increase, we should see higher use of host plant. We did this with these, it was crazy that this works so well. We did this with these little 2-foot wide containers of swamp milkweed, which is a host of monarchs. They grew to be over 1 meter tall by the time we were done. We put them in when they were in 1-gallon pots. We did this in 20 urban parks, and then we had one of these pots per park, and we just monitored them. And huge thanks to Karen Dooley, who did a ton of the work on this project with me and is a co-author on it. She, at the end of the season, put these little newsletters for each park that said how many eggs and caterpillars that neighborhood park supported. And then the QR code was to give the plants away, which we did to the people who were in the neighborhood afterwards. This was all Karen's idea. She's brilliant. Okay. So every 3 or 4 days, we went and we counted how many fresh monarch eggs there were. They're, small but findable. And we totaled the number of fresh eggs per site. Fresh means they were laid within the past 3 or 4 days. They usually hatch or die within that time period. And then we summed the fresh eggs per pot over the season. Each of those 20 parks had a different neighborhood context, right? So they varied in host plant density. So we assessed that by walking the streets that, around each pot in a 125-meter radius, and we counted milkweed stems. And I was surprised to find that every single park had at least one stem of milkweed within 125 meters. So those are our competition. We also measured nectar density, and we did this using our Google Street View data. So we had metrics of how many flower gardens there were within the area around each park. And that's our proxy for nectar availability. So if we look at some results, we found that monarch oviposition rate varied with both resources. And I'm showing it as a table, and then I'll show it as a graph. So we saw a negative trend for milkweed density. So that would indicate satiation. That's the main effect. It's not significant. We saw a weak positive effect of garden density that's not significant, but we did see this significant negative interaction between gardening and milkweed. And I will walk you through what that result looks like. So on the x-axis, we have host plant density in the neighborhood. And on the y-axis, we have gardening rate. And I put a little flower icon there to remind you that we think that's analogous to how many flowers there are. So if we look at how many eggs are laid per stem in these different contexts, so that's how orange the contours are here, you can see that it peaks at low milkweed density and high gardening rate. But I'm actually going to walk you through step by step here because it's an interaction. There are 4 ways we could talk about this. The first way is with low milkweed density, we see a positive effect of gardens. And that's what we predicted, right? That there would be a positive effect, more gardens, more host plant use. With high milkweed density, we saw a weak negative effect of gardens. That's not predicted. It's also not much data out there. So the black points are where the data is. So that one is not as we predicted, but it's also unclear. If we look at the other way, so at low gardening rates, higher milkweed densities might be attractive, but again, there's little data in that quadrant down there. So that inference is also difficult to make. And at high gardens, so top of the chart here, as we go from left to right, we saw a negative effect of milkweed density, right? As the orange goes less orange as you go from left to right. That one's also as we predicted. So we see 2 things we predicted and 2 things we didn't predict. So overall, we saw that monarch host use varied with context. So across these parks, we saw different levels of use. We saw that overall monarchs seem to be satiated at high densities. That's what happens in nature too, so that makes sense. That means that they run out of eggs and there are fewer eggs per plant at a certain point, right? There's diminishing returns to adding more plant. We did, however, see that flower gardens increased oviposition, so more host use in neighborhoods with low milkweed density. So gardens might be attractive to monarchs in those situations. And it also might be that gardens were only a significant source of nectar when garden prevalence was really on that high end of what we observed. We never observed more than 8% of yards as flower gardens. And it could be that they're only substantial sources of nectar at like 7 or 8% of the landscape, right? It would make sense if that were true. Encouragingly though, we did see that monarchs used every single pot. We saw eggs on every pot in the system. And that was pretty crazy because these are 2-foot wide containers with, a dozen stems of milkweed in them. And we saw eggs on every pot, which means that if you added, host plant to this landscape, pretty much anywhere, we would predict a monarch will use it. So to conclude, a lot of this is really broad because these are the conclusions from my whole dissertation, because this is the talk pretty much that I gave at my public defense. So, just bear with me that these are broad conclusions. Give me some license. So in this first section, we saw that gardens are rare, but really important for floral diversity. So they drive big changes in diversity for the city. And we found that they were more common in neighborhoods with higher incomes and smaller lots, so dense, wealthy neighborhoods. we saw that there was evidence for social contagion of flower gardening. So nearby neighbors were kind of taking up the practice when they were near a garden. And that led to significantly improved structural connectivity of garden habitat. And then the last section, we found that clustering of the habitat mattered some for monarch habitat use. So we saw the highest use of host plant in high garden, low milkweed neighborhoods, but also that all parts of the landscape were used. So I think that urban ecology is still kind of like figuring out how to do urban ecology, at least I am. And I think interdisciplinary approaches are really key for understanding how these landscapes work. So like theories and data from social science allow us to characterize the human decision-making that is actually what creates the habitat that we're talking about, or constrains it. And I also think that then basic ecology provides the tools for studying these spatial processes, like habitat functioning and quantifying the impacts of these human processes. And I also think basic ecology can provide some really useful theories that we can test in the city. I think there's a lot of cool directions you could take contagion ecology. So like which people are and which gardens are the most contagious. Remember, I'm biased. I want there to be more gardens. So I'm interested in, can we see neighborhoods with super spreaders? And also, how are pollinators affected by all this? Like I detected clustering, but functional connectivity is a whole other can of worms. And then on a very hopeful note, I think every garden counts for conservation. So, we saw that all of our milkweed got used, and every garden that you add brings us closer to meeting habitat requirements for species in those neighborhoods. And they also bring more non-gardeners close to a garden, which I would say is a key factor determining whether someone will start a garden themselves. And I just wanted to shout out that we did a bunch of outreach trying to get more people to plant gardens. So hopefully that mattered. And last, this work, I would say, like explored a direct connection between people and ecosystems. And I think that's really neat. Like everyday people get to directly create this habitat. And I think that's very inspirational because people often feel powerless in the face of large scale issues like insect extinction. With that, I'd like to say thank you to Karen, Christina, Audrey, and Daisy who gathered data for these projects. Emily Miner, the Crone and Oriens labs all gave tons of feedback on various things throughout this. I got some funding from a Tufts internal grant called Create, and the cities of Medford and Somerville let us do the work in their parks. And with that, I will take questions. Do I have 6 minutes? Is that
You have 6 minutes,
Beautiful.
and maybe more. Sometimes people stay late.
I'm sure you've gotten this question before, but what about backyards? Like, are there cryptic flowers that you didn't see on the landscape, or what do those tend to look like? Do you have any ideas?
So I don't know if the Zoom people heard, so the question was, what about backyards? I would say that it is a note of caution that like our inference is only about front yards. And actually we know that backyards systematically differ from front yards. That is one of the, and front yards are much more heavily studied because they don't require permission. And I could not have gotten 101,000 people to give me permission. So, and it's trade-offs, right? So backyards tend to have like more vegetable growing in them. They sometimes have more trees in them. Like they have different environments back there. Oh, they tend to have longer grass because people are less worried about the grass.
Neighbors can't see it.
Yeah, so yeah, I think the line of sight thing is actually maybe relevant.
So maybe less contagious.
It could be less contagious back there. But also, maybe people can see their backyards to their neighbors, so I don't know. But I would predict that it's more contagious in front yards, which is another reason why I'm glad I did it in front yards, because I was looking for contagion.
Hi, great job, Atticus.
Thank you.
My very limited knowledge of urban ecology made me think of like this idea of like ecological traps in like environments where maybe like some individuals able to disperse in, but is like unable to disperse out, and then that could be like, a bad thing because you're just like stuck in this patch and that will run out of resources or whatever eventually. So I was curious, like this idea of like social contagion that like oh, well, if you're in this garden, like more people are gonna maybe make gardens around you, like, does that like alleviate this idea of like, maybe, it's not so bad if you go somewhere and get stuck for a little bit or.
Yeah, so the question was, does contagion and clustering alleviate the risks of gardens being traps? So I would say we don't know, actually, we know very little about gardens being traps or not. I think it is a very fun idea to think about them being traps, and I think there might be like 2 studies that provide actual demographic evidence of that. I wouldn't be surprised if they are sometimes. I also think that the things that you usually find in gardens have populations that are pretty abundant and stable in cities. There is a group of insects that live in cities, and so, that's what I would say about traps, which is that it's unlikely that the ones we see often are experiencing gardens as a trap. But we don't know. And I could imagine that maybe contagion is taking some neighborhoods above a threshold, perhaps. Like if there's a marginal, if gardens are marginal habitat for that species, it could be that clustering at that scale like might create a high enough percentage of habitat for you. They do have limited dispersal, so I could imagine that scenario. It would be incredibly hard to figure it out.
Yeah, that was a super interesting talk. Really, really cool job and fun things to think about. But one thing I was just curious, because we're talking about, like the social demographics and everything, is I don't know if this is as big of a thing on the East Coast, but like HOAs, becoming increasingly more common and having, strict ordinances. Did you see any, like, how do you think that'll play with contagion? Do you think it'll hurt urban ecology or urban landscape use, or do you think it could actually be like potentially a good avenue to facilitate or seed new contagion opportunities?
So the question was about HOAs, homeowners associations. So are they good or bad for contagion? Do I know anything about that? So my data didn't really address that. And our region in Boston didn't have very many HOAs. In general, a lot of Americans live in HOAs right now. I think something like 20 to 25% of Americans live under the auspices of homeowners association, and they have been reported as being one of the key barriers people say they have to start any wildlife friendly garden. So I would say it is highly likely that that is a constraint. At the very least, it is a perceived constraint. And that's all that matters when it comes to human decision making, is that it is a perceived constraint.
Thank you.
I love the idea of the super spreader. And in particular, I'm wondering if there are super spreader flowers and as a sort of trait of the flower species. And then also thinking about the sort of the function there, if there are particular plants that have the positive benefit on, say, insect diversity, and if there's something cool to do with the interaction between those.
Totally, yeah. So the question was about if there's super spreader flowers, and if you could pick flowers that are good for insects and also super spreaders. So I wish I could have answered that with my data, but I couldn't have. I looked at stuff like that with my 500 yards that I visited in person, but it turned out because they were stratified and random, they tended to be pretty far apart. And so it would have been a different design to walk along a single street and see, are there certain flower species that are spreading along the street? I predict that yes, there are. And I think, it would be a challenging thing to study because there's also all these issues of like, do you live in the community that has a big box store that sells that species and happen to have a sale on them, right? So like there are some challenges with that. I'd love to do an intervention where you add the flower and then you watch what happens. So longitudinal.
It must be a flower that makes everybody run out and buy flowers.
Anecdotally, echinacea, so purple coneflower, was I think the one species in the top 5 most common flowers that is definitively great for pollinators. The other 4 were not, like hosta. It's not great.
Like I'm wondering about the role of like community gardens or like parks, green space gardens, and like interacting with how people perceive their private gardens. Like, do you think that I don't know if you like looked at that at all or like thought about it, but like, do you think that would promote this contagion by like having visible gardening or like gardening resources, or maybe it would like take emphasis away from like private garden space? I don't know if that, just thinking about, I've been to Boston, so like there's lots of like communities.
Yeah, so the question was about community gardens and if they have a role in contagion, and gardening decisions. I have thought a little bit about that. I didn't, I never worked in community gardens, although Karen did. And I think that they are probably big avenues of communication between gardeners. Those people are all already gardening, if at least the people who are members of the community garden. So it's a little bit of a different question. But I could imagine that like planting more species or planting certain flower species is probably also contagious in the sense that you like see other people in the garden, community garden doing it. I think in that sense, it's also contagious between neighbors because they're neighboring gardens. You'll see those more, but I didn't actually, look at that. So, but
Did you look at the ratio of like flower garden to lawn in like mixed use front yards? I'm just thinking like people start out usually small and grow over time. And like, is there a ratio of like lot size or income with that?
so the question was, did I look at like the ratio of flower garden to lawn, right? A reviewer asked me that, two reviewers have asked me that very same question. In our surveys of front yards, we only counted species in the in-person ones. And then in the street view stuff, we just categorized based on amount. So I actually wish that we had gone and at least visually estimated a percent cover of the garden when we visited, but we didn't. So I don't know. I agree that they probably grow. I mean, anecdotally, I talked to some of the people who had the huge gardens that I visited, and like one guy had a border that had taken, at that point, it had taken up like almost all of his lawn was gone. And he said, every year I make it a foot thicker. And I was like, wow. Yeah, it's like a war plan, So yeah, I do think that is a thing.
So the monarch study was really cool, but
Yeah.
I'm wondering about just in general, do you have thoughts about just what the community of pollinators would be as a function of who's nearby? Like, would you expect to see in contagious neighborhoods with clusters that you'd see more species or different species of pollinators, or?
So the question is if the pollinator community or richness would change given clustering of gardens. That's a hard question. I mean, related to what I was saying to somebody over there, I think that it could change the community because, well, I think there is some set of bees, for instance, that are just thriving in the city. They will be almost everywhere. They live in pavement cracks and mostly use weeds. So I think they would just be present everywhere. And then there's probably some other community that is like, you might find them if there's like a big community garden. And so, maybe those species that are not like, that are like on the edge of being able to live in the city, that they need like a big enough patch of good habitat. Maybe those ones I would expect to be added. And then, I mean, maybe they outcompete the really weedy ones in those settings. So it could be that communities change. I don't know, but it would be an interesting area to look at.
We have a question on Zoom, and maybe I think we should close it after that one. So the question was about whether or not you have plans to expand this to other regions, or if you have any sort of insights or intuition about how patterns of contagion might change and in different regions where there's maybe different culture or plant communities. Yeah, and local culture around lawns versus native plant gardens, like drought consciousness, other things like that. And how do you think that might influence some of the things that you were looking at?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in doing this in other cities. I expect to find different things in different cities. Probably especially for the background patterns of who's gardening and how gardens are perceived. I think contagion is probably a fairly universal thing. But I think that the pattern of gardening would vary. So like Yeah, and what the gardens look like probably looks really different. Like, I think you'd have to ground truth this in every system that you've worked, because especially in, for instance, like the desert Southwest, a garden looks very different, or at least a wildlife friendly garden probably looks different a lot of the time, especially if you're trying to xeriscape at the same time, or like have a portion of dry garden. So all of that looks different and acts different. There's the other thing that I'm really interested in is the fact that I think you mentioned like how people perceive gardens. So like there are areas of the country in Detroit or Cleveland where there's a lot of work done on how people perceive what I would call wildlife friendly habitat, but what they would call like a dangerous vacant lot. So if you grew up in Detroit and you are in a neighborhood that has maybe 10% of the population it used to have, a lot of those buildings have been raised, and that's what you associate tall grass with. And so I think those are totally valid perceptions and concerns, and I think they would really change your perception of a like overgrown, diverse flower garden. I think there are gardening movements in those cities too. So, you know, I think it's just a question of like getting people on board and also acknowledging their very valid concerns. Because yeah, in different contexts. Thank you.
So we should thank Atticus one more time, and also to whoever asked that question, he is looking for postdocs, even though he's here for next year.
It was a follow-up postdoc, so maybe a couple years from now.